anymore. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm guessing, hopefully we have a slightly international audience, but I'd imagine we're all somewhat locked down wherever we are. You will see from my background that I'm in a bit of an odd looking room. So to give you some background to my background, I normally live in Singapore. I actually came back here to the UK, see family, etc. for Christmas, and now I am stuck here. So I'm continuing to live and work from my childhood bedroom. So these curtains you can see before me, yeah, I've had them since I was 1 year old, which is when I moved into this room. So there we are, no idea how long I am continuing in this situation. So today we have got our 5th episode of the Street Drugs Discussions webinars. Thank you all very much for joining. Today we're looking in depth at cannabis regulation, policy and markets. Have 2 guests here today who I'm very grateful for joining, and it is a very international panel as well. So firstly, as you can see, we have Marcos Bodin, who is joining us live from Montevideo in Uruguay. Marcos, who will introduce himself to us very soon, works for the Cannabis Observatory in Uruguay. He'll tell us all about the situation there. We are also joined by Dr. Mafalda Pardal, joining us from Portugal, although who works at the University of Ghent. So I thank both of them for joining. Marcus, I first met since the first time we did any sort of a street drugs event together. So this is organised by myself, Professor Joe Neal of Manchester University, and Professor Chris Chandler of London Metropolitan University. So for the first time we organised an event together, it was at London Metropolitan University, back when people could even be in a room together, stuff like that. And Marcos delighted us all by flying in from Uruguay to speak at that event. Mafalda, I'm also fairly familiar with. We are both regular attenders of the annual conference of the European Society for Social Drug Research. So I think possibly it was either 2015 in Frankfurt or maybe 2016 in Lisbon. I think, yeah, it was 20. Yeah, which one was it? Do you think, Mafalda?
I think the one in Frankfurt first.
Yeah, Frankfurt was my first ESSD. So those are great, and any of you listening who are drug researchers, definitely come and join us for future events because they are excellent. So, without any further ado, I will begin. And so, actually, to begin with, I will ask Marcos to introduce yourself. So, if you could tell us, I guess, start telling us what you do for your job. And then from that, I believe you've got a presentation to start with. And actually to say to all the viewers at home as well, please do ask questions. Most people are asking their questions, so use the chat. So please use the Zoom chat function. So you can use it for your compliments and your heckles, but also to ask questions to the speakers. And I think what we will do is both Mafalda and Marcos have a presentation that they will show us. And once they're done, we'll maybe not have some discussion between the two. And after that, we might see what questions we have to ask them. But if anything you hear particularly pricks your ears up, do put the question in then. And it's good. It's a good, and people, continue the discussion amongst themselves in the chat as well. So I can't think of anything I've forgotten to mention so far. So Marcos, if you could share your screen, show us your slides, and introduce yourself, please.
Yes, excellent. Well, hi everyone. Thanks for coming. I am senior lecturer in a private university in Uruguay, University of Uruguay, and I belong to 2 independent groups of researchers, Monitor Cannabis Uruguay and the program of drug policy of CSU, think tank. And I am researching in cannabis regulation in Uruguay since 2014, when a friend called me to form part of Monitor Cannabis due to my experience in evaluating public policy. I am a sociologist and I have a master's degree in public policy, and I'm studying a PhD in economic history, nothing to do with drugs. But the experience in Uruguay is really very interesting to researchers linked to public policy. Well, there are a lot of things to speak, to talk about the Uruguayan experience, but I have James require me to put a focus, right, in my dissertation. So I will talk about the cannabis market in Uruguay after regulation, right? I'm going to share my presentation. Well, I think the name of my presentation says a lot about the situation in Uruguay. Uruguay is a few regulation, right, of cannabis, but in the recreational cannabis market, users don't have full access to legal products, right? That's for me a huge problem, and I would like to share with you data and reflections about this problem. Well, first of all, I would like to frame the problem, right? And I think a good, a very good comparison to make is with the legalization in the United States, Washington State and Colorado State. The two started in 2012, while the Uruguayan regulation passed in 2013. So they are very close, right? The Uruguayan legalization in 2013 was the first at the national level. Right now we have a second regulation at the national level, which is the Canadian regulation of cannabis, right? And the Uruguayan regulation regulates all uses, adult, medical, and industrial use. Right? Well, in 2021, Washington and Colorado, which is the situation, well, they have problems like every legalization, right? But they have established their legal markets for cannabis by displacing the supply from drug trafficking, right? They have generated important reports from the public authority on results in health, in security, and justice. And they produce a lot of data in topics that previously the state did not produce, right? And there is a proliferating scientific literature that has been generated addressing multiple topics, right, of this experience. Which is the situation in Uruguay in 2021? Uruguay has not been able to consolidate the legal supply of cannabis for adult use, right? And then I'm going to explain which is what, right? But we have the legal market, we still have the black market, and it is an important supplier of the market. And we have something new that me and other colleagues called a gray market. I'm going then to explain which is each one. But the first important idea, there is no one market, right? There is three market coexisting, right? Why? Why does this situation happen? There are few specific studies in Uruguay of the public authority on the results. The scientific literature is incipient in Uruguay. And consolidating regulation and the legal market is not a concern, it's not a priority of the authorities right now, not even before COVID, right? It is not a priority for the authority. Well, why is Uruguay in this situation? Well, I don't have a complete explanation, but there are some aspects of the Uruguayan regulation that you have to know, and they are linked to this result. First of all, the authorities encounter many difficulties when trying to consolidate the sale of cannabis through pharmacies. As you know, the Uruguayan regulation has three main channels: home growing, cannabis social clubs, and pharmacies. You can buy, right? You can buy cannabis in the pharmacy. In the three channels, you have to be registered to be a legal user, and you can register only in one channel, not in two, not in three, obviously. Well, the pharmacist was devised as the main supplier, obviously, right, of the legal market. To grow is difficult for many people who has to grow indoors. It is very expensive, right? Mafalda is going to talk to you about the problems of the cannabis social clubs, and they are expensive too. Not everyone can access to a cannabis social club. So the pharmacy was devised as the most important channel. And it is established in the law. The law establishes that the supplier have to be pharmacy, not another dispensary, right? Well, which are the difficulties? Difficulties with the bidding process. This is very, have a lot of problems. You have to investigate every enterprise to see if it has links or not with traffickers, and there are another legal problems. There are opportunistic behavior of the authorized companies, and they do not meet their production quotas. And the state in Uruguay does not require it until now. There is the banking problem. I think you know about that. And there is a refusal by a part of the pharmacy sector to sell cannabis. Uruguay is politically divided in departments, right? And there are departments which have just one chain of pharmacies with one owner, and the owner have a moral argument to sell cannabis. Many of them, for example, don't want to. They have a pharmacy, but they don't want to sell drugs, so they don't sell cannabis. So the whole department can't access to legal cannabis because the owner of the chain of pharmacies don't accept to sell cannabis, right? It is required to change the law to find new dispensing points. Management is required to improve the bidding process and the compliance with the production quotas. We have in the IRCA, the agency in charge of regulation, they have managing problems every day. And there is no clear political will to tackle these issues decisively, and there are all problematic issues or difficult to fix, right? So in this context, how was Uruguay's growing recreational cannabis market in supply? Because between 2014, the measurement in 2018 and the measurement in 2018, we experiment an increase in the last year users from 9% of the total population between 15 years old and 65 years old, from 9% to 15%. This is an important increase. So we have a growing market. So, which is who is supplying this market? Well, to understand the figures, we have to know two important things. There are two main products in Uruguay, and it is very different to the situation, for example, in the United States. One product is dried herb or flower buds. This is the most preferred product, right? And this is right now the most important consumed product. But before regulation, it was not the most important product. It was a rare product or a secondary product, right? It is cultivated locally from growers, seeds, clandestine plantations too, that sell illegally. Legal provision through pharmacies is of mandatory organic cultivation. The product, that's another problem of the supply through pharmacies. There are a lot of requirements for the producers, and it is, and this is very, very important, it is considered by the government a health benefit of regulation, right? Why is considered a health benefit of regulation? Because the most important product in Uruguay before regulation was pressed cannabis. Maybe most of you doesn't know what is pressed cannabis, but it is the most important product used in South America. It's a traditionally illicit product. It is produced in Paraguay. Paraguay is the most important producer of cannabis in South America, and it supplies Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. Pressed cannabis combines flowers with other parts of the plant, and they are pressed with chemicals products to form bricks. Yeah, these bricks facilitates the international traffic, right? And the composition of non-vegetal products varies a lot, right? And it is scarcely known. A study made in Uruguay by the University of the Republic found 52 toxic products in pressed cannabis, right? Its potency is variable, but it is considered a very low potency product because it combines flowers, but to another part of the plant. So with legalization, a lot of people dedicated to grow in their homes, and the users want to smoke dry herb or flower pots, as you want to call it, right? Because it is a much better product, and it is a much safe product too. And for the government, it is a benefit, right? It is a benefit to consume herb instead of pressed cannabis. The second important thing you have to know, there are three main ways of access to cannabis. At the legal market, one way is the legal market, right? And as I said, you have three channels in the legal market: pharmacies, home growing, or CSCs, cannabis social clubs. Right? We have last year users in Uruguay as the last national survey report 250,000 users, last year users in Uruguay. And we have 60,000 registered users, right? Only 60,000 registered users. Mainly, as you can see, in the pharmacies, 43,000 users in the pharmacies. And you have to see, between parentheses, we have in the whole country, right, 14 pharmacies that sell cannabis. Just 14 pharmacies for 40,000 users. 2 tons a year in a market of 24 tons, right? Well, the second way to access is the gray market. What is a gray market? The gray market is made up of actors not linked to drug trafficking. They are growers mainly. They are some of them are registered, but the majority of them are not registered. Members of CSCs, of cannabis social clubs, or pharmacy buyers who trade their surplus. Because in Uruguay, the law establishes that you have to you can produce up to, or you can receive from your club, or you can buy at the pharmacy up to 40 grams. For many users, 40 grams a month is a lot. So they have surplus and they trade it, right? So this is the green market. These players have become major suppliers to the cannabis market, mainly the growers, the home growers, right? And finally, which is the traditional illicit market, which is called in general black market, right? They sold pressed cannabis imported from Paraguay through the border with Brazil. They diversified their offer, and they right now are offering two products: pressed cannabis and dried herb cultivated locally. And they are dealers, and there are points of sales called bocas. Boca is the word for mouth in English, right? And they offer a variety of drugs. So, right? They offer cocaine, they offer cocaine paste-based, cannabis, and other drugs. And that is an important point for the government. Look, for the government, to smoke dry hemp is a benefit, and to deal with growers is a benefit, because the growers doesn't offer you cocaine, right, or other drugs. They have cannabis. So the situation is strange, but this is not worrying for the government, right? Well, here you have data from the last national survey on drug use, right? It is a survey in the whole country, 10,000 inhabitants or more cities, and people between 15 and 65 year old. So I resume here, I sum up here, sorry. The most common access to cannabis, as reported by last year users, right, in 2018. So as you can see, 25% of them, the last year users, 25%, the most common access to cannabis is through the black market, 27% through the legal market, 36% through gray market, and 30% is unknown, right? If we broke down this figure, what we found, what is legal access, right? The 27% of legal access. It is confirmed by registered cultivators, cannabis social club members, pharmacy users, registered pharmacy users, and people who share from a legal origin. If you share the cannabis, it's not sold, share. If you share cannabis from a legal origin, it is completely legal in Uruguay. It's not a crime, right? Well, what is the cannabis from the black market? Well, it is pressed cannabis bought to a dealer or a point of sale. Someone bought to a dealer or point of sale, or shared pressed cannabis bought to a dealer or point of sale. And this is the new figure, right? At the beginning of regulation, it was a huge impact to traffickers, because the users wanted dried herb or flower buds, and they don't have the product. So slowly they diversify the offer, and 13% of the user buy flowers to a dealer or a point of sale. And finally, we have what I call the gray market, right? And we have unregistered cultivators, people who bought to a cultivator or a cannabis social club member, right? And people who, a friend or a relative, bought flowers for him to a cultivator, a CSC member, and flower or shared flowers originated in an unregistered cultivation, right? So 36% of the user have the most important supply of cannabis in the gray market. We don't have numbers about how many this represents in tons, right? We don't have that kind of measurement. But it's clear that at the level of individuals, the most important supplier of the market is what I call the gray market. Well, to end, which is the evolution comparing 2014 and 2018, the national service. Well, in 2014, 60% of the users declared that the most frequent way of access to cannabis was pressed cannabis from narco trafficking, right? And in 2015, it is 12%. We have the legal access, and we have the gray market, right? But the traffickers, dealers, and point of sale have diversified, and 13%. The most frequent way of access is flower bath from dealers, from the black market. Well, which are the lessons that I would like to discuss with you? The most important, the rapid consolidation of the illegal market is a key aspect in the regulation of cannabis, right? Uruguay is a clear example of a failure in this aspect. The legalization in Uruguay created a great expectation in users to access a quality product, but the regulation didn't offer a quality product, right? Users who are registered as well as growers found a public eager for that, and in a short time, they become important providers of the recreational market, right? As a user told to me in an interview, Marcos, if you have a good bud, you immediately become a dealer, because people want flowers. The activity of these providers at the gray market in Uruguay today shows no signs of police persecution, right? But this could change depending on the government objectives, obviously. I interview a lot of policies in the drug board, and they told me growers are not our target, but they are doing traffic. For us, they are traffickers, but they are not our target, right? The promise of the new government in Uruguay since 2020, we have a new government, is greater repression of trafficking at all levels, right? So if the police decide to target local producers and it produces a scarcity in illicit cannabis supply, while there is no improvement in the legal supply, who will satisfy the demand, right? That's a problem. Finally, failure to consolidate the legal market allows traffic-related actors to rebuild their offer and find a place in the new scenario. And legalization was devised to impede this evolution, right? Well, thanks.
Thank you very, very, very much, Marcos. That was fascinating. I think as a criminologist, my favourite insights from there were about the organised crime groups seemingly being somewhat marginalised by the legal trade. I find that very interesting. Also that they diversified and they were forced to increase the quality of their product in the face of a legal competitor. There were a couple of really good questions asked. I will delay those, I think, until a little bit later. So thank you very much, James and Brendan. and I can confirm that the James who asked the question is not me. I'm not planting questions there. But yeah, please do ask more and more questions. And I think, yeah, later on we can ask those to both of the speakers. So now I will move on to Mafalda. So please, Mafalda, if you could introduce yourself, tell us about your research, tell us about what you do for work, anything else. And I believe you also have some slides and a presentation prepped. So yeah, take it away, Mafalda.
All right, thank you, and thanks everyone for joining this session, and thanks to James and the team to invite me to join this session as well. So yeah, I'm as James trended also in the motherland. So I'm speaking to you from Portugal, but I'm affiliated with the Ghent University in Belgium, where I'm a postdoctoral researcher and an assistant professor in criminology, and where I've been mainly focusing on studying issues related to illicit markets and cannabis policies for the last couple of years. And in particular, my main attention has been going to the study of cannabis social clubs. So my PhD actually focused on a study of cannabis social clubs in Belgium. And then in 2018, I had the opportunity to actually spend some time in Uruguay. So I've also met Marcos before this session. And I spent some time working at the Catholic University of Uruguay with Professor Queirolo and the team there. And I also did some field work in Uruguay. So I'm also very pleased to hear the presentation from Marcos and the update on the situation now. And I have plans to return to Uruguay as well to continue some study into actually something related to the presentation of Marcos as well, the changes in the illicit market dynamics post-legalization. But COVID has gotten a little bit in the way of those plans. So for the moment, those are a little bit on standby. I will try to share my screen and start my presentation with the idea of just giving a brief introduction on the topic of cannabis social clubs. I think it should be working now. So I just thought of giving you a little introduction on what are cannabis social clubs, just some highlights from research on the topic. And then if you have more questions and want to discuss any particular issues with relation to this topic, I'm happy to follow up in the discussion part of the session. So basically, what is a cannabis social club? This is an initiative of adult cannabis users who typically come together and form an association. So this does not mean that their activities are considered legal in the face of the law of their domestic jurisdictions, but that they take the steps that any other association would do to sort of formalize themselves as an association. And they usually take the status of a non-profit association. So any revenues generated in these associations is sort of reinvested in the working of the association. They are, or they form a closed circuit. So these clubs, the cannabis social clubs, are only open to members. So users need to complete the registration process, and only those who have registered with that club can access the club and the cannabis that is produced within that cannabis social club. Cannabis cultivation usually takes place on a small scale, so the clubs would normally try to produce amounts that correspond to the personal use needs of their members. And usually this happens in a sort of collective way. So the people who grow the cannabis are members of the cannabis social clubs themselves, and so they share then the result of that production with the other members at cost price usually. So again, with the idea of not generating profits, but just of being an alternative and offering this possibility for users who do not want themselves or do not have the capacity themselves to grow cannabis for their own consumption. So it is really based on an idea of cooperativism, and sort of the cannabis social clubs also try to live up to the idea of being social spaces and generate opportunities for sort of interaction between peers, also to be spaces that provide some support for users, that have links to other organizations that work, for example, in the field of harm reduction, and offering sort of a safe space and a possibility of contact for cannabis users. So these are some of the ideas, some of the original ethos behind the creation of cannabis social clubs. And finally, they're also engaging in activism because, and as I will talk about in a little bit, most of the cannabis social clubs are actually active in a context and functioning in a context of prohibitionism. So they're not necessarily or at all legal. And so activism is a big part of what they do, trying to advocate for a change in the status quo and to see cannabis laws reformed. And I should point out that these are the typical features, and as this is a point I'll come back to later, but not all cannabis social clubs will adhere to these ideas and will have the same practices that I've just described. But just in a nutshell, these would be sort of the core characteristics of what a cannabis social club ought to look like, or initially was thought of. And just to give it a little bit of context, and also to make the link with the topic of legalization and cannabis policies more broadly, which sort of also is connected to this session, I just want us to sort of look behind this binary choice, or this apparent binary choice that usually this is how the debate is framed or tends to be framed between prohibition and legalization. And this is oblivious of the many other choices that are behind or that are involved when one or a jurisdiction decides to legalize cannabis or other substances. So the design of cannabis policies will imply choices in terms of who or which actors will have the possibility of cultivating and supplying cannabis, if this will happen on a non-profit or on a commercial basis, if it will be for recreational purposes or medical only. So a range of decisions will have to be made, and a different range of supply models will be appearing as a result of those choices. And the cannabis social club model is one of those. And has been described in the literature as sort of a middle ground, in-between model, in the sense that it remains a non-profit model, at least in principle. So it sort of shies away from the risks of having a full commercialization, which has been the preferred choice in the many US states so far. And it also allows the growers and the users to keep agency and to sort of engage in this supply model that they have so far constructed themselves for the most part. The cannabis social club model has actually been included in some legislative proposals so far. So I've included here just some examples from Portugal. That's the first one on the left, and in Belgium as well. These two proposals were rejected in Parliament. Then also in Mexico, and it's currently being discussed, a proposal that would also envision the creation of consumption clubs or social clubs, I believe up to 20 members, and with I think up to 4 plants that could be cultivated per member. And the last one is the case of Uruguay, which has been approved, as we know, and as Marcos already mentioned in his presentation. There have been also other regulatory efforts at local and regional level in Spain, but these have so far been blocked then at the national level. So there has been some activity in this area, and this is just to show you that the cannabis social club model has been included in some of these discussions, and in fact has made it into some of these proposals that have been brought to discussion. However, and as I was already mentioned, Uruguay remains the only national jurisdiction to have regulated the cannabis social club model so far. And within the EU, cannabis social clubs have not been regulated and are not officially tolerated by any national authority. So the existing clubs continue to operate at the margins of what are the current legislations and are subject to legal sanctions. So they stay in a rather vulnerable legal position at the moment. And I should emphasize that they are really the result of grassroots initiatives of cannabis users for the most part. So in the absence of formal regulation, the cannabis social clubs that continue to operate have sort of tried to create their own self-regulatory codes. They've constructed their own codes of conduct. They formed alliances and created so-called cannabis social club federations, which have then also in turn issued some code of conduct for how those clubs affiliated with that entity should operate. And this ranges everything from number of members that a cannabis social club should have, quantities that are produced, quantities that are distributed, and the frequency of distribution, price, and so on. So a lot of these practices are being sort of forged by these associations themselves, again, not in a formally regulated context, but by themselves and by their own efforts. But if we take a look back at where this all started, the Cannabis Social Club is also often referred in the literature as the Spanish model, because that's at least has been documented as the first context in which cannabis social clubs appeared. Now, the history of CSCs in Spain is quite rich, and I will not cover it and I will not do it justice here, but I just want to highlight 2 or 3 points or 2 or 3 elements that I think are interesting to keep in mind. The first one is how the cannabis social clubs, and this I think has links to cannabis social clubs in other unregulated contexts, for example, in Belgium as well. They've explored some of these particularities or oddities or gray zones in the Spanish legal framework. So in Spain, the possession of cannabis for personal consumption in private, it's not considered a criminal offense. And in Spain, and this was primarily in the case in the early 90s, there was this jurisprudential doctrine that had been developed, and it sort of stated that the possession of an illegal substance by a closed group of users for consumption within that closed group of users was also not not seen as a criminal offense. So this created the concept of shared consumption, and the cannabis users and activists in Spain sort of try to explore these 2 elements and argue for the possibility of creating cannabis social clubs as spaces that also provide that opportunity for shared consumption. An important milestone in the development of the cannabis social club model and movement in Spain is the appearance of ARSEC. This is one of the first or seen as sort of the pioneer association that was officially registered as an association in 1991 in Barcelona, and it's seen as the first one to organize collective cannabis cultivation within the context of this association. And they did this, which is, I think, interesting, after consulting the public prosecutor. So they actually issued a letter where they asked the public prosecutor whether, in principle, in theory, it would be okay for them to, considering having in mind this legal background, if it would be okay for them to engage in this kind of activity within the context of an association of users. The public prosecutor response was positive in theory again, so it did not reflect the particularities of the case. And in fact, they went ahead and they had the police intervene and confiscated the plants. But this was a very symbolic moment, and it's been considered as sort of a Catalan breach, because a lot of users after this experiment came together and started forming their own associations of users and replicating this experience of organizing a collective cultivation in the context of these kind of associations. A lot has happened in between, but I would highlight here another important moment, which is the appearance of the first cannabis social club using this term. So this happened in 2001. And the difference here is that the clubs explicitly, or these associations explicitly acknowledge as a goal and as part of their activities, the cultivation and use of cannabis. So they no longer refer to themselves as associations de estudio sobre el cannabis, meaning associations for the study of cannabis, but they actually acknowledge that they are cultivating and distributing cannabis among their members. And they started using the term of social clubs, cannabis social clubs. Today, the cannabis social clubs continue to be present in Spain, still unregulated at the national level, as I said earlier, and with about 800 to 1,000 clubs, although it's hard to have an accurate estimate as they continue and sort of operating in a sort of in-between zone. In Belgium, there's also been cannabis social clubs present since 2006, also without a formal regulation. But at the moment they're facing, or one could argue that they're facing extinction. So a lot of the clubs in Belgium have had legal issues, have been forced to close down or are fearing prosecution. And so they have taken the initiative to stop their activities as well. The movement in Belgium has not reached the proportions as we have seen in Spain. So there have been at best a dozen of cannabis social clubs active at one given point. But it has had a constant presence since 2006. And also here it's been sort of taking advantage of gray zones in the legal framework. Uruguay is the first country indeed to have regulated this model in 2013. And there's currently about 165 legal cannabis social clubs and over 5,300 registered members of these clubs. In other contexts, it is likely that cannabis social clubs are also present, and there are some accounts that point to that, but we know very little about what the cannabis social clubs are doing in those contexts and if they are in fact operating. Just to give you an idea of some of the reporting on these, I've included just some examples. Cannabis social clubs seem to be reopening or appearing in New Zealand. More recently, also, I found this news about cannabis social clubs popping up in South Africa, also in Costa Rica more recently. So there seems to be, in a way, spreading or appearing in different contexts, in different jurisdictions, despite or not having a regulation or an acknowledgement by the official authorities for that. And with this in mind, together with Tom DeCourt, Melissa Bones, Oscar Pares, and Julia Johansson, I hope I'm not forgetting any of my colleagues, we've developed an exploratory study, 2018-2019, where we, with this in mind of sort of the absence of a real picture of what was happening with cannabis social clubs in Europe, we wanted to try and map that and just have some initial data on the presence of cannabis social clubs in Europe. And so this was an exploratory study. It was a bit of a hobby project, so it's not representative. And I think at best, we sort of touched the tip of the iceberg on this, but still, we found cannabis social clubs present in 13 EU member states. And you'll see the UK is still included here. This was pre-Brexit. So there were at the time quite some CAC activity also in the UK and in other countries that we were not aware of before. And as I said, this is likely to be an underestimate. We know that there's hundreds of clubs in Spain and in the UK as well. And in other countries, we only had 81 participants in our study. So I think there are probably more cannabis social clubs that we did not reach. And there were some countries where we could not exclude whether or not there were cannabis social club presence, where we had contradictory reports or we did not have sufficient evidence to allow us to really be sure whether or not there were clubs in those countries. That France is an example. In terms of the timeline and sort of looking at the year of establishment of these cannabis social clubs, this is also data coming from that study. We confirmed some things that we already knew. So this early presence of cannabis social clubs in Spain here, but also we were sort of surprised to see that there were also earlier experiments in other countries, in the Czech Republic, in Poland. And really what it's noteworthy is that there seems to be more cannabis social clubs being established in the last decade as well across Europe. I also wanted to just show you a little bit of what are the reflections of cannabis social club representatives on the cannabis social club model. So these are, I've included here some quotes from people I interviewed throughout some of the studies in Belgium, in Uruguay, and in Spain. Just to give you a sense of sort of the visions of those involved in developing and implementing the model on what a cannabis social club should be or ought to be in the future, because I think it will illustrate the point that I want to make next. So for some of the CSE representatives, the cannabis social club should be seen and they should always keep in mind that we are political action more than a cannabis shop. But then on the other hand, or in similar terms, we found also some comments from other representatives that pointed to cannabis social clubs being a form of active protest in defiance of existing legislation in a peaceful manner. But then on the other hand, we saw that also some remarks that pointed to cannabis social clubs functioning almost like shops, like coffee shops. So clubs that are open to tourists with low cannabis, quality cannabis and high prices, like coffee shops. You buy it, you smoke it, and you leave. Others were very strong on having a position on CSEs not being a commercial model. Another interesting point that some respondents touched upon was this idea of the club, and it's something I referred to in the beginning of my presentation, of having this harm reduction role. And so some reflected on this by saying a club has a community role. It's a community that receives a consumer, and as a community, you talk to people to see what's happening with them. So for them, this was something that it was important and that they wanted to see the Cannabis Social Club focusing on in the future. But then I had also some comments from cannabis social clubs and that did not share this view at all. And so for this representative of a club, actually the CSC model was not going far enough. So for him, the idea of a club resembles the idea of a sect. It's about prejudice. It's still a model that reflects prohibitionism. So, and this is just to show you that within the cannabis social club movement and those that are involved in actually creating and running these associations, there are quite different views on what a cannabis social club should look like and the role it should play in a range of different areas, whether it should be operating on a non-profit manner or whether it should be also possible to have a more commercially driven profile, whether it should invest or engage in this kind of social harm reduction like role, or whether it should exist at all, and whether we should move on to other models that are perhaps going further in the direction of perhaps commercialization. And I think this is interesting just to show you the range of opinions and ideologies and visions behind the model, but also it sort of shows in the practices. So not only in the study we did in Europe, but in other research that has been done so far, we've seen a range of practices and almost different types of cannabis social clubs emerging. So I drew this typology in one of the studies I conducted, but I think it captures the situation not only in Belgium, but in other contexts as well. So we've seen clubs that have maybe 5, 6 members, but there's also clubs that have been identified in, for example, in Spain that have 15,000 members, where arguably these people do not know each other. And so they are a bit moving away from that idea of being a cooperative of users who know one another, who sort of just come together and sort of try to cultivate and share the cannabis among themselves. We have seen cannabis social clubs that still adhere to this idea of being a non-profit association, but there's also been some cases of cannabis social clubs that have actually moving towards commercial models. And some of my colleagues have actually talked about these as being cannabis commercial clubs. So they are doing promotions, for example. They have marketing strategies that the typical sort of cannabis social club would not necessarily have. They're trying to recruit new members. They're open to tourists, for example. This has been documented primarily in relation to cannabis social clubs in Barcelona. But in other contexts, this is also possible. Just to give you another example, there's also this aspect, which I think was quite important at the beginning when the model was sort of emerging, of having this social role and playing a harm reduction role, but also we see cannabis social clubs that are not engaging at all. And so I call them the lonesome clubs, where they function almost just like a point of delivery, although they might be functioning on a non-profit way. These are spaces where people come to just collect the cannabis, and there's not really any interaction between users or any sort of provision of other activities or opportunities for socialization or to have a space to interact perhaps with other organizations in these clubs. So just to say that perhaps I started with a very simple definition of cannabis social clubs at the beginning, but the reality is much more complex than that. And I think I just wanted to bring these nuances to the table. And hopefully there's a number of implications deriving from these for policy, I think for research as well. But I'll leave that perhaps for the discussion section. And I hope this feeds some questions as well from your side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very, very much for that, Mafalda. And actually, I have a few questions I want to ask. There's one I might jump straight in with. Could you go back to your previous slides, please?
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of our audience are UK based. And when I read your one of your papers earlier, I noticed you identified quite a large number of cannabis social clubs in the UK. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about them. One is how they fit in legally, and another would be in terms of these characteristics of social clubs that you've identified that vary. I wonder what your typical British cannabis social club looks like.
Thank you. Thanks for that. And for reading the paper. No, so the cannabis, I would say that in the UK, the cannabis social clubs, or part of the cannabis social club movement, has organized itself behind this UK CSC, which is sort of also a federation or at least an umbrella organization. And for example, one of the elements that they have tried to adhere is this 9-plant limit. So which I believe it's not considered then commercial or trafficking activity, and so if they are detected by the police, they have perhaps lower sanctions deriving from that. And so they've also developed a set of practices. A lot of the clubs have actually been inspired by one another. So this is something that I'm also now trying to learn more about, is how, for example, activists in Belgium have learned from what had been done in Spain and perhaps in the UK. What have they taken in from the experiences in other countries? But there are certainly some things that are particular to the specific context. So, for example, while in Belgium, they've done or they have adhered to this idea of 1 plant per member. In the UK, this is the 9 plant limit seems to be the idea. And I think initially, but I'm not as familiar with the context in the UK, as for instance, Melissa Boney's, for example. But I believe that there was a strong focus on medical cannabis as well, and on filling that void, certainly perhaps in the earlier phase of the movement. And so also in our study, I think we found quite some cannabis social clubs in the UK, which would be sort of here, only providing cannabis to medical users. So of course, this is then left up to the clubs, but what this would mean is that they would have an intake interview of potential candidates that want to join the Cannabis Social Club. And typically what they would do is that they would try to get to know that person, and they would ask them to sort of show what are their medical claims, if they've been followed up by a doctor, et cetera, and that they would not be open to taking users that are taking cannabis recreationally. So this would be sort of one type, so to say, of Cannabis Social Club that we saw in the UK. But then in terms of the other range, I think we see a little bit of everything. And that's been the case even in Uruguay, where you have a legal background. And so this is why I think it's so, I mean, for me, it became also interesting to see how these would suit other contexts as well. Because also in Uruguay, we saw these lonesome clubs popping up. So cannabis social clubs with not really so much of an engagement in harm reduction or in social aspects, which perhaps I would have anticipated to see more. And so they were functioning more almost as non-profit dispensaries. So I don't want to take too much time, but just to say, you'll find a little bit of all these different variants, and no matter the context, I think. It's hard to say you have predominantly one type. I think you will see, because there's, even within the UK or even within Belgium, Spain, you will have within this one of these jurisdictions different voices and different opinions about how to shape the model. So you'll then see this reflected in different variants or different types of clubs popping up there as well.
Okay, great, excellent, thank you very, very much. So we've got a few questions and comments now, and there's one comment I might jump on actually to ask a question of Marcos too. So Mags and Steve Lyons had said that quite often that pharmaceutical company resistance and historical propaganda has had a huge impact on worldwide policy. And so Marcos, I can wonder, related to that, could you tell us a little bit about what the political motivations were for Uruguay to adopt their regulated system? And in addition, perhaps if you know anything about the role of the pharmaceuticals industry in Uruguayan regulation and the politics that preceded it, especially since it seems that pharmacies are particularly relevant to the regulation system in Uruguay.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was it was a very special moment when the government in 2012 decided to propose the legalization and regulation of cannabis, right? For one side, at the political side, they were seeing that the drug markets were becoming extremely violent, like in Colombia and Mexico. So they wanted to prevent an intensification of that violence. And some members of the government they thought that cannabis is the most important at the time. It was the most important illegal drug, the one that have most consumers, and they thought that it could be the beginning of a new policy to deter the increasing violence in drug market. So they proposed regulation as a solution, as one solution to the problem of security, right? But in that time in Uruguay, there was a very important social movement who proposed the legalization, right? And the leaders of that movement have a lot of links with the government, right? So the government wanted to regulate, and they need these people because they were the only experts on cannabis in Uruguay, right? So the government doesn't know anything about cannabis, right? So there was a very intense dialogue between activists and politicians and scientifics too, but the size of the scientific researchers in Uruguay in drugs or drug policy is small still today. So it was an encounter between the government and the social movement, and I think there were various motivations. Right? But one important thing you have to know is that the government sent to the parliament a law of just one article, and the whole regulation law is a creation of the parliament, and members of different parties, political parties, participate in the elaboration of the law. Right? So it was a very discussed law, right? I don't know exactly why the government wanted exclusively to dispense cannabis through pharmacies. Everyone in the group of the researchers and professionals linked to drugs recommended not to put pharmacies in the law because anything can happen. So we have to have alternatives, and we don't have alternatives. And I don't know why the government pressed to put pharmacies in the law. I know everybody knows that that is a huge problem because we have to change the law to create new dispensaries, right? And what happened with pharmacies? It is very complex because in the pharmacy sector, not in the laboratories, right? I'm speaking about the pharmacies, the shops, right? There are different unions, right? So the government speak with one union that is not representative of the whole sector, and that union told to the government, yes, we are going to sell, and there is no problem. We want that business for us, right? But another union doesn't want to sell cannabis, right? So that is a problem. And there is a third union, which is the union of the professional chemists, right? Every pharmacy in Uruguay needs a professional chemist working inside the pharmacy. And they are one of the most important opposers, right? Because one of them, or some of them, thought that they are signing for selling cannabis, and they have moral arguments about that, right? So really, I don't know what was thinking the government when they decided to put pharmacies as distributors. Sorry.
Yeah, I think no, great. Thank you very much for that. Very interesting. And you think it's very unlikely they will change? You think pharmacies will be the main point of the Uruguayan model going forward, you expect?
I think this I think we have to promote the legal market. That's it. It is really incredible that we have a full regulation and we don't have a product, legal product. That's a huge problem, right? And we have to produce. The state have to improve the production of cannabis, right? Because we, if the whole pharmacy sector wanted to sell cannabis, we don't have product to give to them. Right? So first we have to improve the production, and the state needs to have a different relationship with the firms, right? And the other problem is the distribution, the dispensation of the product. We have another kind of dispensaries. In Latin America, we are the country that have more clinics for inhabitants, right? So we have clinics and we have another kind of shops that can sell cannabis, and this is very important to change this. But the problem is that it is not a priority for the government, because part of the government or part of the functionaries of the National Drug Board or maybe the IRCA, they feel that they are accomplishing the objectives of the law, because they say, well, people is smoking a better product and they have less contact with traffickers. So that's a good result.
Great, thank you very much. I've actually got a couple more questions for you. So I'm going to run through the remaining questions we have for Marcos and for Mafalda. So if anyone has any more questions, please put them into the chat. So Marcos, James who is not me, asked, has there been an increase in the use of butane, hash oil, edible cannabis or THC vape carts in the legal market? Is there evidence of this in Uruguay?
No, we don't have edibles, right? We don't have an industry of edibles, right? that was not contemplated in the law. We have people that make muffins with cannabis, and they sell it in the streets, right? But or the weekend markets, right? But that is not very important, I think. We don't have that vaping is increasing. The use of vapes is increasing, right? And we don't have data about concentrates. As you know, in Colorado, for example, dry herbs are decreasing and concentrates are increasing, and the prices are decreasing, right? We don't have data about concentrates. I know that they enter the market, but we don't have any estimate of the consumption of concentrates.
Okay, great. Thank you very, very much. There's another question to Marcos, which is, would US federal regulation, which would remove the banking issues globally, lead to more pharmacies entering the system?
Yes, totally. I think that if United States pass a federal law legalizing cannabis, it's going to have a huge impact for the world, because many banks, for example, in Uruguay, the problem is that the banks, Uruguayan banks, have relationship with the Bank of America, so they don't want to offend the Bank of America, right? So if this changes, obviously many pharmacies will want to enter the cannabis market, because it is profitable to them. It is very profitable, fundamentally for small businesses, and there are a lot of small businesses in Europe.
Great, and I am going to connect that to another question for you. So Adam Jameson said, very informative, thank you. In Uruguay, is it specialist pharmacies supplying cannabis, or just any pharmacy? Do they require a special license?
Please repeat, I don't understand.
So Adam asks, are there specialist pharmacies that sell cannabis, or is it any pharmacy? And do the pharmacies need a special license for selling cannabis?
No, a pharmacy needs a special license to sell cannabis, and the state gives the license.
I see. Great. Thank you. I've now got a couple for Mafalda I will move on to. So one is a statement, but I'm going to change it into a question. So Oliver Selleck said he really enjoyed your research and he hopes to see cannabis social clubs become legal and well regulated on the national level. Do you think there is any movement in that direction in any countries? Is this something you anticipate, or do you think it's likely they'll continue working in this grey area, semi-underground, semi-getting away with it? And I'll add my second part to that is, do you expect, do many receive police action? So, you know, one is, do you think they'll become legal? Secondly, in a way, does it matter? Because do you think they will kind of keep on getting away with it?
Right, thanks for the question. So I think there is some movement, and as I mentioned, it has been included in some of the legislative proposals, so far not successful. But for instance, the one in Mexico is moving ahead. So I think this could be a real possibility that they are also included in the legislative reform there. Within Europe at the moment, there are no clear proposals or steps being taken in that direction. Well, in Spain, this has been tried a number of times. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's perhaps some more willingness to consider this. They've actually, at the level of Catalonia, for example, it was a very short-lived legislation, but they managed to pass it on popular demand. So they collected, I think, close to 50,000 signatures and brought it to discussion in Parliament at the regional level, and this was approved. So it was then contested at the national level, and the argument there was that the regional parliament did not have the competence to regulate on this area. But there have been examples in Spain of attempts to legislate this. In terms of your second question, it does matter. So I think you see both. Even in Spain, I think it's a good example. There had been for some years some tolerance of the cannabis social clubs, and even some sort of acceptance, so to say. The police knew that the cannabis social clubs were operating in some municipalities. Even the cannabis social club representatives actually informed the police in some cases. This is also, I think, to some extent the case in the UK, by the way, where there's a level of transparency and of outreach from the clubs actually towards the public authorities. I've also seen this in Belgium, where they sort of announce, and at the beginning when I started my research, I thought this is quite strange that they go and ask to see the police officer and tell them we're going to start a cannabis social club, and this is what we will do. But there has been some change in Spain, for example. The last court cases involving cannabis social club affiliated growers or people in a position of leadership have actually resulted in conviction. There's been, I think, one that has gained quite some media traction. A secretary of quite a historic cannabis social club has been convicted to 5 years in prison, for example. In Belgium, one of the last standing and the oldest cannabis social club is also awaiting the result of a court case. And if this is also a negative outcome, it's likely that the cannabis social club will also shut down. So it does matter, and there seem to be, I think, and that's the whole issue with being on this limbo. Depending on what are the priorities for law enforcement, the police might become more intervening in trying to detect cannabis social clubs, and they might have more court cases. And so it will depend on what are the priorities, and these seem to be changing. Even in Spain, there are regions where now there seems to be a more repressive approach, while at the same time these regulatory attempts have been made not so long ago. So it is a little bit of a limbo situation, I think, for most clubs, and this is also true for other countries, I think, in Europe, certainly.
My first go of speaking while muted. I'm amazed it's taken me this long. First tonight anyway. And actually one more question for you, Mafalda. Ricardo Pereiro Carvalho has asked, is there an economic influence on cannabis social clubbers? Are they predominantly more present in higher or lower economic classes?
Thank you as well for the question. I think this is an area where we still need to learn more about. So who are the users of the cannabis social clubs? If I understand the question correctly, who are the sort of the segment of the population that joins these clubs? From some data in Belgium, and I think in Spain as well, and I think there's a study also being done in Uruguay on the profile of members of cannabis social clubs. It seems to be primarily somewhat highly educated users, middle class users as well. So not so much the lower classes. In Uruguay, this would be the case. I think I would expect to see this as well, because, for example, the price of cannabis in the cannabis social clubs is higher than in the pharmacies, for example. So it is perhaps more of and this is something that I've heard in the interviews I did in Uruguay, that it was described to me as being more of an elitist option within the options that they have in Uruguay. In other countries, I think we still don't know so much about this, but there are some indications from Spain and from Belgium as well that this is sort of the profile. Some middle class, educated folks, mainly regular users, which is not surprising, and male users as well, predominantly.
Okay, great. Thank you very, very much. I think I just have one more question now, and this is for Marcos. So for everyone else, this is your last opportunities to get a question down. Oh, we have, oh no, that was just a thank you. So if you have a question, please do put it in the chat in the next few minutes before we call it a night. So Marcos, one more question for you. This is from Zach, can you explain alpha 1 and beta 1 and why they have a low THC rate? Does this increase sales to the black market? Do consumers in Uruguay want a higher percentage product? And is this demand being met by the black market?
Yes, alpha 1 and beta 1 are the two varieties that you can buy in a pharmacy, and they have a relative low percentage of THC. I don't remember the range, but I think it is between 2 and between 7-8% THC. And it's true that many people complain about that. I know that there were plans of offer a variety with more THC, but that plan was discarded. I really don't know why. But with all the problems with the provision of cannabis to the pharmacies, it is not rare that the plan was, the new variety was discarded. Right? But the problem is that the main users, the people registered at pharmacies are not heavy users, are not mainly heavy users. So what
some
we
of them go to the
see
clubs,
through,
right, Marcos? Sorry to interrupt.
yes. They go to the clubs, or they are growers, or they buy to a grower, right? And in general, heavy users have 2 or 3 suppliers, different kind of suppliers, right? So there is not a demand on the state by the users, right? The pharmacy users are mainly occasional users, and people of my age, 45, 50 years old, right? So people who want to have all their business legal, but that they are not heavy users. In fact, people who buy at pharmacies don't buy every month. You can buy up to 40 grams a month, and many people buy 1 month, the other not, and buy the other month, right? So I think that the regulation needs a pharmacy who offer variation of product to attract the heavy users, because the heavy users are the ones who move the market. According to surveys, the 14 to 20% of users consume the 90% of the product in Uruguay. Maybe we have error in this, but they are the very target of the regulation.
If I can just add to that, I think just to note that, for example, in the cannabis social clubs in Uruguay, there is no restriction to the amount of THC percentage of the cannabis they distribute. So something I heard in the interviews I did there was indeed that one of the reasons for people to join a cannabis social club was to have access to a range of variety of cannabis strains, and with cannabis strains with a higher percentage of THC as well. So I think while that's not available in the pharmacies, the cannabis social clubs have actually played that role to some extent as well.
To add to what Mafalda says, the cannabis clubs are like a brand in Uruguay. If you say, hey, this joint is from a cannabis club, you're saying this is a very good product and potentially a product with a high potency, right? So there is a demand on the production of the cannabis social class. That's why the members sometimes sell their surplus because the people value the product of the cannabis social class.
Cool. I don't know if either of you have anything to add, but I think it looks like we are all out of questions. So no, in which case I will say many, many thanks, Marcos. Many, many thanks, Mafalda. This is excellent.
Thank you.
Very enjoyable, interesting and informative. So thank you very much. Also, thank you very, very much to everyone else who has joined us. Great to see you here, and we hope to see you at future ones. So I think I'll leave it at that. I will briefly share my screen to show you what we have coming up. This is confirmed enough for me to share it, Joe, is it?
It is, yes. Yeah,
great.
we're all on. Yeah.
So we have coming up. Can you all see the poster? Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
no, no,
Yes.
no. Oh, can you?
Yeah, we've got it.
Oh, we've got it. Cool. Excellent. So in 2 weeks' time, we're very, very busy. We're moving straight on to from cannabis to alcohol, and we have Professor David Nutt being joined by Joe. Joe, would you like to tell us anything more about what to expect in 2 weeks' time?
Well, David has, of course, just published this book on drink, so about the harms of alcohol, how to drink sensibly and responsibly, if that's possible. And actually, he has, for a number of years, has been developing, as a real harm reduction approach, an alcohol substitute. So a safe alcohol substitute that contains no alcohol. And actually, his interim botanical product is available, and I've ordered some. So it's supposed to be on its way. So by this time, hopefully, I'll have tried that. Yeah, so it's mainly about the harms, and there's a lot of, I suppose, misinformation about the real harms of alcohol. And he's done a lot of research on this and compared the harms of alcohol to nicotine and to all the illegal drugs. And of course, psychedelics come very, very low down, not causing much harm. But that's a really cool, cool analysis. And cannabis doesn't come very high either, of course.
Cool. So yeah, I hope we can be joined by as many of you as possible in 2 weeks' time when we have Professor Nutt. So I think I will say good night and thank you to all. Yeah, great to chat.
Thank you.
Yeah, hope to see you all again. And as ever, as I always say, hope to see some of you in person at some point when such things as being in the room with people you don't live with, and maybe even traveling might be possible again. So has been great. And yep, all the best. Have a lovely weekend all. And I look forward to speaking to you, hearing from you, and maybe even seeing you soon. Yeah, and also great to see you, Mags and Steve, in the crowd. Hope to see you again. Okay, cheers. Happy Friday. Good night to all.
Happy Friday.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you, everybody.